Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Spirit of Prophecy podcast. Appreciate you joining me for another episode. Very excited about today's episode. Hopefully, you will find it very interesting. I am fascinated with this subject, so sometimes I might do programs just because I like to talk about it, but it's always my hope that other people will enjoy hearing about it too. This is a subject that interests me greatly, and I hope it will interest you too. But just a little commercial. This is probably going to be the last episode with this particular look. You'll notice some stuff behind me looks different. I've been rearranging things in my office. We're going to have a whole new setup pretty soon. I'm really excited about it. I think it'll look a lot nicer, a little more professional. And we are hoping to continue putting out some really good content and having some really interesting guests. And so thank you for supporting this program and just helping get the word out about it. And I appreciate it. I am greatly encouraged by just a lot of the feedback I get, just going to different places, meeting people who tell me that they watch this program. It's very encouraging to know that a lot of the work and the study that goes into this, that people are benefiting from it and being helped. And so thank you for just helping get the word out and helping keep me motivated to continue doing this. It really is a blessing, and I would do it, I think, if nobody watched it, just because of the fact that it motivates me to study, and I enjoy learning these things. But I'm going to admit, it is more enjoyable when you know other people are being blessed by it. And so thank you for sharing the fact that you've been blessed and helped. It really does keep me motivated. And while often I will do subjects, because I know people are interested in them and want to hear about it, sometimes I do things because I am interested in it and I want to talk about it. And that is what today's program is about. And we're going to talk about the sons of God in Job. And I've referred to this before on a program I did recently called I Will Sit Also Upon the Mount of the Congregation in the Sides of the North. I referred to this and about what I believe about Job, but I do want to expound on that a lot more. I got a lot of good feedback from that. A lot of people agreed with me on that and thought that that made a lot of sense. But I didn't. That's not something I just pulled out of thin air. That is something that does have some biblical basis, and so I want to share more of that today, and hopefully you all will learn something that will be helpful to you. So in Job chapter 1, in verse 6, a lot of people, they will use this passage here as proof of the Nephilim doctrine, that the sons of God were angels. Now, I'm not going to talk about Genesis 6. We're not going to go into all the different proof texts that they use. But let me just say, people who believe that the sons of God were fallen angels, go to Job, and the way I'll read this passage the way they read it, okay? So Job 1:6 says, "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, Doth Job fear God for naught? And you all know the story. Satan gets permission from God to go after Job. And then in verse 12, it says, So after this, so Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. Now, the way the Nephilim people will read that is the angels are coming and they're presenting themselves before the Lord in heaven. And Satan also shows up in heaven before the Lord, and he starts accusing, he's that accuser of the brethren, and he is for sure that, and starts accusing Job and gets permission to go after Job. And then he leaves the presence of the Lord. He leaves heaven. He comes to earth. He goes after Job. And more proof too, it's heaven and earth. It talks about going up and down. And so therefore, all this takes place in heaven. And this is proof that the sons of God are angels. Well, before I give a much better explanation, let me just ask some questions that you can't answer if you believe that those are angels. But if you believe that they are saved men, these are questions that I for sure can answer. And I believe many people are missing the obvious, and this is my opinion here, because their thinking has been distorted by dispensationalism. And so there's just some obvious truths here that they're missing because their thinking is wrong as they're going through the Bible because of dispensationalism. So here's a question I have. So if the sons of God are angels and they're presenting themselves before the Lord, can you explain to me what they are doing and why they are doing that? What does that mean for angels to present themselves before the Lord? What's going on? Okay, now, while you can speculate all you want, can you give me a scriptural explanation for what is happening? Can you show me some place in the Bible where we see angels presenting themselves before the Lord and it explaining what that process looks like and what is taking place? No, you can't. You absolutely can't do that. You can't do that. But I can show you where men are doing this. And I can show you where it is. And it's not in heaven. It's on earth where this takes place. So we'll look at some examples of that in a little bit. But you can't answer that if you believe that they are sons of God, or they are angels. Obviously, they're sons of God, but they're angels. And so, in Leviticus 14:11, it says, "And the priest that maketh him clean shall present the man that is to be made clean in those things before the Lord," okay, "at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation." So notice in Leviticus that we see men and they are presenting themselves before the Lord. That's exactly what the sons of God were doing in Job. They are presenting themselves before the Lord. Now, while it does not say where that took place in Job, and the Nephilim people just assume it's in heaven, in the Bible, where that took place, where people would present themselves before the Lord, was not in heaven, it was at the tabernacle. The tabernacle is where they would present themselves before the Lord. They would do it before the door of the tabernacle. Now, the door of the tabernacle faced east. That's significant. We're going to point that out why that is in a little bit, but the door always faced east in the tabernacle, and that is where they would present themselves before the Lord. In Leviticus 16:7, it says, "And he shall take the two goats and present them before the Lord at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation." So notice where they did things. They present things before the Lord at the tabernacle of the congregation. Deuteronomy 31:14, "And the Lord said unto Moses, Behold, thy days approach, that thou must die. Call Joshua and present yourselves in the tabernacle of the congregation, that I may give him charge." And Moses and Joshua went and presented themselves in the tabernacle of the congregation. So I show you all that to just show, I'm showing you places in the Bible where they presented themselves before the Lord, and it was always at the tabernacle of the congregation. Now, in your dispensational mind, you say, well, no, none of that was before Mount Sinai. You're wrong, and I'll prove that to you. You're just dead wrong about that. You got that from your dispensational books. You didn't get that from reading your Bible. I will give you a very clear explanation of why that was before Mount Sinai here in a little bit. I'm showing you examples of men presenting themselves before the Lord, and it's always before the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. That's where it's always at. So Joshua 24, this one's very significant. Joshua 24, a very familiar passage of Scripture. That's where we have, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." But in verse 1, it says, "And Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem, and called for the elders of Israel, and for the heads, and for their judges, and for their officers, and they presented themselves before God. And Joshua said unto all the people, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, Your fathers dwelt on the other side of the flood in old time, even Terah, the father of Abraham, the father of Nahor, and they served other gods." So a couple things. So notice, here we are again at the tabernacle. They're presenting themselves before the Lord. We can assume very safely here is before the tabernacle. In fact, we'll see that for sure here in a little bit where this took place. It's always at the tabernacle. We can assume it's before the door. I'll show you that here in a little bit. But in Job, we have the sons of God presenting themselves before the Lord. We see Satan also showing up, and we see the Lord speaking to them. Now, it is, before I get into my beliefs about Job specifically, did you know that when God would speak to them, it didn't necessarily have to be out of the vocal cords of God. It could be through the priest. It could be through a prophet where God would speak. And so here, as we have all the leaders, because what's happening in Joshua 24 is very significant. First off, they've just come into the promised land. They've come into the promised land. They've been possessing the land, and they are establishing a covenant. They are establishing a covenant here that not only are they in that generation to follow, but all the generations after them are supposed to follow. What is happening here is very significant. Spiritually and legally, it is very significant. So they are doing this at the tabernacle. They've got the leadership all there. This is big, okay? In America, we talk about, Independence Hall and the signing of the Declaration of Independence and how what took place that day, that birthed our nation, and the laws and things that were implemented in the Constitution that came around that time. We are still obligated to follow those things to this day. And even more so, this was significant because these things were directly from God and had such greater significance prophetically, because God is going to preserve, or God is going to bless all the nations of the world through these people, and someone who specifically who's going to come from them, Jesus Christ. So this is a big deal, what's happening here. And notice it says in verse 2, and Joshua said unto all the people, thus saith the Lord God of Israel. And then for several verses, Joshua, out of Joshua's mouth, he is speaking things that the Lord said. So understand, God is speaking to Israel. He's speaking through the mouth of Joshua, and these are the words of God that he is speaking. So just like in Job, we have the Lord speaking to those who are presenting themselves before the Lord. And so jump to verse 25. So Joshua made a covenant with the people that day and set them a statute and an ordinance in Shechem. And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law and took a great stone and set it up there under an oak that was by the sanctuary of the Lord. There it is again. They're presenting themselves before the Lord. Where? At the sanctuary, at the tabernacle. That is where they would do these things. And Joshua said unto all the people, behold, this stone shall be a witness unto us, for it hath heard all the words of the Lord which he spake unto us. And it shall be therefore a witness unto you, lest ye deny your God. So Joshua let the people depart, every man unto his inheritance. And remember that stone. Okay. Hopefully I don't forget to tell you the significance of that stone that they put there and why that matters. Okay. If I forget about that, this isn't live. So you're just going to be out of luck. Hopefully I can explain it in the comments. But anyway, we see this practice of presenting themselves before the Lord by standing before the priest at the temple. God would speak to them. God would give them instructions. This is how God spoke to them in the days before the scriptures. There was a time when they did not have the scriptures, and the believers, the sons of God, they would go and they would present themselves before the Lord. They would do it at the tabernacle before the priest. And God would speak to them in that way, and God would give them instructions, and God would give them commands. That is something. And let me tell you, that was around before Mount Sinai. And proof of that, one proof is in Job. We are seeing the same practice in Job that we see Israel doing in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy and in Joshua. Now let's go back to Job. And so back in Job, in chapter 1, in verse 7, notice it says, and the Lord said unto Satan, whence comest thou? Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro in the earth and from walking up and down in it. And I've heard people take that up and down part, and that's proof that he's going, up and down from earth to heaven. I mean, look right there. It says going up and down in it. Well, here's the problem with that. The Bible also said in Leviticus, thou shalt not go up and down as a talebearer. Okay, going up and down and to and fro, it's just kind of almost like a north, south, east, west. It's just like going all over the place. That's what that means. It doesn't mean going from earth to heaven and heaven to earth. That's ridiculous. Okay, that's what you need it to mean, because you need it to be in heaven to fit your wacky Nephilim doctrine. But that is not what Satan is saying. Satan's just going all over the earth, causing problems. And, the earth has always been wicked, and Satan's always been a part of that. And so Satan being the accuser of the brethren, he's probably accusing the world, and rightfully so. But then God points out Job to him. And so verse 12, we saw too, well, proof that it's in heaven. It says, so Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord, and that's in heaven. Are you sure about that? Does the presence of the Lord have to be in heaven? Are you going to create a weird hermeneutic? Because this is what people do when they have bad teaching. They just declare a hermeneutic. They pull it out of some section of their brain that probably does not work properly. And it's just like, wait a minute, where'd you get that hermeneutic? Who are you to create rules for the Bible? But theologians try to do that all the time. We were recently having the discussion about, Jesus suffering in hell, and a lot of people, desperately trying to make the Bible fit their doctrine. They teach that when Jesus was in hell, he was preaching, which is hilarious. And because he talks about by all, so he went and preached into the spirits in prison. And it's like, no, we literally see where Jesus preached liberty to the captives in the Bible. Jesus did it in the synagogue. He said, this day the scriptures fulfill in your ears. And then I had a preacher tell me, no, the Bible never calls men spirits. So you just created that rule. First off, I just showed you a place that does. And so right there, it's literally doing that in Peter, and it makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense that that's referring to the Jews, because they weren't in physical bondage, but they were in spiritual bondage. The problem with these people is they were trying to achieve righteousness through the law that brings bondage and condemnation. And so it's brilliant. It makes perfect sense to refer to them as spirits in prison, because they're not people in prison. They're not a nation in prison. They had a freedom. They had, the control to do certain things in Israel during that time, but spiritually they were in bondage. It's like the spirit of Antichrist. How do you have the spirit of Antichrist? Well, if you're going around teaching that, Jesus Christ didn't come in the flesh, you're of Antichrist. And these are people, but they have spirits. They're speaking by spirits and bad spirits and all that. The word spirits used in a lot of different ways. But I'm literally showing you a place, but they just declare a rule. No, it can't be that, because I have declared this hermeneutic. That's dumb. And so what people will do when they are desperate to make the Bible fit their wacky doctrine is they will just declare a hermeneutic. The problem is there's always exceptions. And it's just so funny too, because one of these flip-flopping preachers who's always changing his doctrine depending on whoever he's hanging out with, he kept throwing out these hermeneutics at me, and I kept showing exceptions. And then just right there on the spot, he would update his position. And it's just like, I think you need to think through your doctrine a little more. Why don't you go believe something for a few years, test it out through scriptures for a while, and then come give me the answers to the secrets of the universe. Because right now, you don't know what you're talking about. That's why you're all over the place. And so people will just declare something like, no, it's presence from the Lord, that's got to be in heaven. But no, it doesn't. In fact, we can see in Genesis 3:8, and they heard the voice of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God amongst the trees of the garden. The presence of the Lord was on earth during that time. Oh, that was before the fall. That was in a different dispensation. That was before the fall. Genesis 4:16, and Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. Okay, that's on earth. How did Cain get away from the presence of the Lord? If Cain leaves the presence of the Lord, then wouldn't that mean the presence of the Lord was somewhere on earth during that time? And he goes and dwells in the land of Nod on the east of Eden, which is away from the presence of the Lord. Now, I don't know where the presence of the Lord was during Genesis chapter 4, but you know what? It was somewhere. And wherever it was, God spoke to Cain during that time. Now, how did God speak to him? I don't know for sure. The Bible does not explain in detail how that worked. Did he do it from a tabernacle? Did he do it just from a voice in heaven? Did he do it through an incarnation of Christ during that time? The Bible does not tell us, but it does tell us God spoke to him, and Cain fled from the presence of the Lord and went somewhere away from it, meaning it was on a place on earth during that time in Genesis chapter 4. We see in Jonah chapter 1, verse 1, now the word of the Lord came unto Jonah the son of Amittai, saying, arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry against it, for their wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah rose up to flee unto Tarshish from the presence of the Lord, and went down to Joppa, and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare thereof, and went down into it to go with them unto Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. Okay, now, the Bible does not tell us where the word of the Lord came to Jonah from. It is my assumption that it would have been from the temple, because during that time, the presence of the Lord was in the temple that was in Jerusalem during that time. And the Bible does not specifically mention Jerusalem. It does not specifically mention the temple, but it does mention the presence of the Lord and that Jonah fled from it. And it tells us where he went to get away from the presence of the Lord. But it didn't work out. But I would assume, it is my assumption, that that was reference to the temple and he was getting away from Jerusalem. But either way you spin it, the presence of the Lord was on earth. So do you realize every detail that we've seen in Job, where we have people presenting themselves before the Lord, where we have the presence of the Lord mentioned, I have shown you in the scriptures where those type of things are happening on earth. Now let me ask you, why do you think it's heaven? And it's not, you don't think it's heaven because of what you're reading in the scriptures. Absolutely, you do not think it's heaven because of what you're reading in the scriptures. You're thinking it's heaven because somebody told you it was. Somebody assumed that it was because they needed the sons of God to be angels. And I'm sorry, you are just wrong. Now, I personally think I can tell you exactly where that event took place in Job. I personally believe I've been there. Now, it could have been somewhere else. It could have been somewhere else, but all the biblical evidence would point to it being in the place that I'm going to show you. But either way, it was somewhere on earth. Even if it wasn't the place that I'm going to show you where I've been, it was somewhere on earth. End of story. There's no doubt about that. But people get confused on this because they're always reading their Bible with bad hermeneutics that they pulled from dispensationalism. Things that dispensationalists came up with. But there is so much, and a lot of people think all of this stuff started. Well, all that stuff you're referring to, that was with the tabernacle. That started at Mount Sinai. That was in a different dispensation. No. Here's what you got to get a hold of. The things of the temple, the Levitical priest, the priesthood, those things were not started at Mount Sinai. They were given to Israel on Mount Sinai. Get a hold of that. Okay? Lose your dispensationalism and get a hold of this truth. Those things did not start at Mount Sinai. They were given to Israel at Mount Sinai. Sacrifices did not start at Mount Sinai. We see Abel offering a sacrifice to God. We see the presence of the Lord somewhere on earth with Cain. From the very beginning, God had a place where he dwelt. I believe a tabernacle, and Cain fled from it. We see sacrifices before Sinai. We see clean and unclean animals before the law is given. We see that in Genesis chapter 7, where God told him to take 7 of all the clean animals. Why? I personally think partially so they could do some sacrifices, but not every animal that was clean were ones they sacrificed. I think for eating. Some people teach they didn't eat meat during that dispensation. They were all vegetarian. Based on what? I think they did eat meat during that time. We see in Genesis, we have Jubal or Jabal, one of those two. You know, he was the father of those that have cattle and things like that. What were they raising cattle for? For pets? Maybe for milk. But even that's not really vegetarian. I think they were doing it for meat. I think they were the ones that started that. And that's why the line of Cain was able to thrive and survive, even though God had cursed the ground for them. An additional curse had been put on the line of Cain, but they were able to thrive because they were eating meat. And it wasn't forbidden to eat meat. But a lot of people just assume because we see it mentioned not to eat, or to eat meat, but not with the blood in Genesis, that's when they started eating meat. No, God just told them not to eat with blood during that time. But how do you know they weren't even supposed to do it before that? We just see it mentioned there. A lot of people assume the death penalty came after the flood because God said, whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. But in Genesis 4:14, Cain speaking says, behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid, and I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth, and it shall come to pass that everyone that findeth me shall slay me. Why was everybody wanting to kill Cain? Because he murdered somebody, because he killed his brother. So just understand, again, all of this, it conflicts with dispensational teachings and talking points and hermeneutics, but they're just wrong. That's all there is to it. They're just wrong on how they view scriptures, on how they break things down. Obviously, God in sundry times and in divers manners spake, he spake in different ways. There were certain things that were instituted later and things that changed throughout time. I agree with all that. Dispensationalists are right when they state some of those facts, but how they break those things down and how they categorize those things are full of flaws, because ultimately they have warped everything and they've shaped their systematic theology into a way that makes Jews better than everybody and makes it where God's not done with them. And that's just wrong. That there's so many mistakes that in what they teach. We don't have time to go into all of their errors. But at the same time, if what I'm saying to you, as much scripture as I'm giving you, is not convincing you, it's probably because you are reading your Bible in light of dispensationalism. If you've not seen these things before, it's probably because your thinking was clouded by dispensationalism. So just remember, the sacrifices, the things of the tabernacle, the priesthood, they did not start at Mount Sinai. They were given to Israel at Mount Sinai. So in Genesis 14 and verse 17, it says, and the king of Sodom went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of Chedorlaomer and of the kings that were with him in the valley of Shaveh, which is in the king's dale. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was priest of the Most High God. Now, this is important too, because I'm going to show you where I believe this event in Job 1 took place. And it was not in heaven. It was on earth, and I think I know exactly where it was. I believe I've been to this place where this event took place. And so, something I want to show you. Before Mount Sinai, before the law, during Abraham, we have a priest of the Most High God in Salem, which is later called Jerusalem. Here's what you got to understand about geographic locations. The names of these places change throughout time. I am right now in Rock Falls, Illinois. This area has only been known as Rock Falls for probably 100 and some years. Before that, I don't know what this area was called. I live in the state of Illinois, but this state hasn't always been a state. This area hasn't always been called Illinois. The names of things change throughout time, especially as different people take these places over. And so during Abraham's day, when Melchizedek was king of this area, it was known as Salem. Later, it became known as Jebus. The Jebusites had possession of this place. And then it wasn't until David that he took over the land of Jebus, and they changed the name of it to Jerusalem. And he captured that city of David, which is where they eventually built the temple. So it had many different names throughout time. During this time, where Abraham meets up with these kings and with Melchizedek is in the valley of Shaveh. Now, we only see that valley of Shaveh mentioned one time. There's one other place the name Shaveh is in the Bible. I forgot where it is. But the valley of Shaveh, where is that? Well, it says, which is the king's dale. See, when Genesis is written, it sometimes gives us the name of places as they were named during that time, but it will specify to Israel what it is, and it would give whatever the current name was for it, so they would understand where they were talking about. Now, you and I, we don't pay that much attention to these things because we don't live there. We're not from these areas. We've never been, most people have never been there. But when you go to these places, all of a sudden you start paying a little more attention, and you start picturing these places in your mind. And so this valley of Shaveh, which is the king's dale, okay, make a mental note of that. That's where Abraham meets up with Melchizedek. And he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth." Melchizedek's blessing Abraham. Why? The less is blessed of the better. Melchizedek is greater than Abraham. And blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand. And he, Abraham, gave him, Melchizedek, tithes of all. What's Abraham doing giving tithes before tithes were instituted in the law? They had tithes before the law. You know why? Because they had a tabernacle before the law. They had a priest before the law. They had all these things before the law. Okay, the tithes were given to the Levites later after Mount Sinai when God transferred those things to them. But these things were always around. And so, that's all we need to read of Genesis chapter 14. But Melchizedek is just referred to. Not much is said about him in Genesis chapter 14. But we can conclude a few things. One, he's greater than Abraham because the less is blessed of the better. And Hebrews talks about that. We see he's a king of Salem, or he's known as the king of righteousness. We see in Psalms, thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. That's quoted in Hebrews 5, 6, and 7. Very significant passage right there. And that Jesus would be a priest after that order of Melchizedek. So what I personally believe when it comes to all this is that this took place right here in this area. Okay, so I want to point out a few things. So right there on the left, we see there the Dome of the Rock. This is what Old City. Here in this valley, this is today is known as the Kidron Valley, but notice it was called the Valley of Shava in Melchizedek's day, instead, which is in the King's Dale. Now, there's one other place in the Bible where we see the King's Dale mentioned, and that is in 2 Samuel 18:18, and it mentions and Absalom in his lifetime had taken and reared up for himself a pillar, which is in the King's Dale. For he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance, and he called the pillar after his own name, and it is called unto this day Absalom's place. So notice Absalom's place was in the King's Dale. And if the Valley of Shava is in the King's Dale, then we can assume Absalom's pillar is in the valley, or Absalom's place is in the Valley of Shava. Now, I'm going to show you some pictures, and this today is what they call Absalom's pillar. This is, so right there, that pillar you're looking at right there is right, let's get it, hopefully you can see my cursor on here. It's right in this area. I believe it's right here in this spot, if I'm not mistaken. But it's in that area, in that valley. Now, is that the pillar that Absalom set up? Probably not. It is believed that that particular structure was probably 700 years after Absalom, so it could be something that was changed, something that was modified by another group later. But either way, that area is where they will tell you today where Absalom's place was, and they refer to that particular structure there as Absalom's pillar. And it's hard to tell from these pictures, but this is a very large pillar, and it is a pretty cool thing to see, and it's right there in what today is known as the Kidron Valley. So it's definitely the same valley. Right next to it, past it a little ways, that is known as the tomb of Zechariah. And that was something, too, that was several hundred years after the time of Absalom. But what you're looking at right there would have been around during the time of Christ. These are all pictures that I took when I was over there in Israel. But if you continue going down that valley, in fact, let me get Google Images back on. If you continue going down this valley, the Kidron Valley, or the Valley of Jehoshaphat, is another name for it. The Kidron Valley, all these things, you will end up over here. You see the Gihon Springs, which we believe was a water source for the temple. And somewhere in this area is where the temple was. Now, interestingly enough, I believe it's hard to tell here on Google Earth. But somewhere in this area, I believe this is the spot right here. And hopefully you can see that. I believe it's in this spot right here. This is something they found, I think, roughly 20 years ago, under several feet of just dirt and debris. They found this area that they will tell you was a place where there was a temple or a tabernacle at one time. They will tell you they did sacrifices here at one time, that this here is a blood channel. This is where they would sacrifice the animals and the blood would flow out here. That round thing there, they'll say was an olive press that they would use in temple sacrifices. And you can't really see it here, but behind this thing here is a stone that they set up. And we see we saw there in Joshua where they set up a stone. They said, this stone heard all the words that you said. Now, where that was in Shechem where they said all that, but whenever they would make these covenants with God and wherever they would set up these tabernacles, they would often set up stones as kind of a memorial and a reminder. And you have a stone that is set up in that spot that they found there that they think is one of the things they did. They talk about Jacob in Shiloh or in Bethel. He set up a stone there that he anointed, and because the presence of the Lord was there. And so they believe that stone was placed there similar to the way they would do it in these other places. I don't know that for sure, but it does. It seems consistent. Here's a picture of me there at that spot. Pretty cool moment. Here is a picture of Eli Shukran, who is the lead guy who excavated all this and found these. That's him on the left. On the right is Robert Cornuke, who is very interesting individual. I would encourage you to go on the Framing the World website and buy some of his books. They're just fascinating. They'll get you interested in the archaeology of Israel. There's a picture of Paul filming them for the documentary. And here's a picture of me and Robert Cornuke, and just very interesting individual, very knowledgeable on all this stuff. And he can tell you facts that will blow your mind. I'd like to have him on the program sometime to talk about all these things, because he's just, not only is he knowledgeable, but he's just very interesting. He's very easy to listen to. His books, if you read them, they're very easy to read. Reading on archaeology sounds boring, but it's not. Because he does a really good job writing. But anyway, they will all tell you that area there is where Jerusalem started, that there was a place of worship here. And guess what? It faces the east. It faces the east, just like the temple did, just like the tabernacle was always supposed to do. It always faced it east. And so it was before the door of the tabernacle, okay, that would face east, where they would go and they would present themselves before the Lord. And so somewhere in that area that we were looking at these pictures is probably where Melchizedek's temple was. And probably too, they won't tell you this over there, but it's probably where they built Solomon's temple and where the second temple was built. They won't tell you that over there, but I mean, everything points to it being that is where the temple would have been. And so Melchizedek, who I personally believe, and I'm not going to argue with anybody about this right now, I believe he was a pre-incarnate Christ. That's who I believe he was. And I personally believe he was operating on earth up until God transferred things over to Israel. That's what I personally believe. I believe there has always been a high priest. I believe it was always Melchizedek until God gave it to Israel and to the Levites. And then Jesus took it back over, and he currently is the high priest, and he will be the high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, not after the order of Aaron, not after the order of the Levites, after the order of Melchizedek. And so right there in that area is probably where that took place. And so when we read that story in Job, we don't need to think of a place. We don't need to think of it being in heaven. No, we need to think of it being on earth. And where would it have been during Job's day? Most people believe that Job and Abraham were probably contemporaries. And Abraham was not the only saved guy walking the earth during his day. No, but he was someone special that God chose because of his great faith. And God chose that he would raise up the seed, the Messiah, through Abraham. God decided that he was going to use a nation, because the world kept going bad. We see that even before the flood, the world went bad. God had to destroy it, start it over. We see after the flood, the world went bad, and God had to confound their languages at the Tower of Babel. And then the nations were scattered during that time. But were there zero saved people until Abraham came along? Of course not. There were still some saved people, but it was only a matter of time before they were probably going to go bad again. So God chose Abraham, because God said, I know him, that he will command his children after him. And God chose to raise up a nation through him. And God chose to turn his focus to one nation, to Israel. And God gave the oracles to them. God gave the things of the tabernacle to them. God gave the priesthood to them. But all those things that God gave Israel existed before Israel. The house of God did not start with Israel. There's always been a house of God. There's always been a priesthood. The sacrifices have always been until the final sacrifice was made at Calvary. And so people are missing this because their thinking is wrong. So when we're reading Job, and if you realize this probably happened during the time of Abraham, but for sure before Mount Sinai, before God instituted all these things, who are these sons of God? They're believers. What are they doing? Presenting themselves before the Lord, giving sacrifices, giving offerings, like Abraham did to Melchizedek. Do we really think Melchizedek was sitting around in Salem for all those years just waiting for the one guy, that one believer, Abraham, to show up and give an offering? No, other people were going to him too. But again, the Bible focuses on Abraham after that in his line, because it's through him all the nations of the world are going to be blessed by. But they were not the only believers on earth. That's just wrong. And so all of this is important, I believe, because it's significant, because again, when you understand this properly, it takes away a lot of the main arguments for a lot of dispensational foolishness, including the Nephilim doctrine. What they teach about Job makes no sense. What we just taught you here today makes perfect sense with the Bible, but not with dispensational theology. But I do believe you can be a dispensationalist and still believe and accept what I am teaching you here about Job. Did you know that? It's okay. You don't listen, I know how desperate you are to hang on to that word dispensationalism and all that kind of stuff. But, recognizing this truth, that alone will not destroy everything you believe. Okay, go ahead and get one more thing right, dispensationalists. Throw out your stupid Nephilim doctrine and accept the truth that this was something that was taking place on a tabernacle in the presence of the Lord on earth, more than likely with Melchizedek, more than likely in Salem, and it very well might be somewhere else, probably in that spot. Those of you who take those trips to Israel, one more thing you ought to think about when you're over there in that city of David. Not only should you be thinking this is where the temple was at one time, you need to think this is where Satan showed up and presented himself before the Lord with the sons of God. They did it in that area. This area has always been special. You know why? You want to know why this area right here has always been special? Not just because God knew he was going to build a temple here. Okay, and let's just say the temple was right here in this spot. Okay, but the reason that this was so important, the reason it was so significant, is because this is something everybody will agree with. Everything in the tabernacle was a picture of what Jesus Christ would do on Calvary. You could say it this way: everything in the tabernacle pointed to the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross. And did you know that I believe the tabernacle literally pointed to the cross? Literally. Because if you go across this valley, right up here in this area, you have a bunch of rock-cut tombs in this area. It's some of them are behind these houses, some of them are under these houses. There are some rock-cut tombs over there. And the Bible tells us that when Jesus cried out with a loud voice and gave up the ghost, it mentions several things that took place. It talks about the rocks being rent, the tomb graves opening. It talks about the veil of the temple being rent, and the centurion and the soldiers that were with him. They saw all these things. They saw what? The rocks rent, the tombs open, and the veil rent. They saw that. They saw the renting of the veil from the crucifixion spot. You know what that means? That means that they were east of the temple. That's what that means. They were east of, they would have had to have been east of the temple. And so therefore, if the temple was over in this area, the crucifixion would have had to have been somewhere over in this area. Now, today, they want to tell you that the temple was right here in this spot, and then which would mean Jesus would have had to have been crucified way over here on the Mount of Olives. And it would have had to been about this far over because it had been high enough, because if it's down too low, you're not going to see in there. Well, that's going to be really hard to see it from that far away. This is a much wider valley over here. But nobody claims Jesus was crucified over here. If you want to know the places where they believe Jesus was crucified, they will tell you this is where the temple was. But then it was over somewhere in this area. Yeah, here we go. The Garden Tomb, Jerusalem. They'll tell you it was over here. Well, that's not east of the temple. And if you want to go, and then the other place they say was at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is somewhere in this area. But either way, both spots where they will tell you today when you take your Zionist propaganda trip are the opposite direction of what the Bible testifies of. So again, they've got everything wrong. There's so many things they have wrong. The reality is the Kidron Valley is where the Kidron, somewhere in the Kidron Valley of Shaveh, that was where Abraham met Melchizedek, and it was somewhere in that area. Right here is a video from me in the Kidron Valley. Up there to the right, somewhere in that area is probably where the temple was. Up here over to the left, not that far away, this is a narrow valley, is probably where Jesus died on the cross. This Kidron Valley, this is where the blood is going to flow to the horse's bridles that we see in the Bible. If our interpretation that the blood flowing to the horse's bridle is a literal thing, that happens in the Valley of Jehoshaphat. On your Zionist propaganda tour that you took over to Israel, they told you it was going to be in the Megiddo Valley. I can prove 14 different ways why that is wrong. I'm not going to take time to do that. I think I've done other programs on that already. But no, this is where that's going to take place, down there in this very narrow valley in the Kidron Valley. What an amazing walk that was. And hopefully one of these days I'm going to take another trip over there and invite some people, and that is one of the things we will do. We will walk through the Kidron Valley, and it will blow your mind as we walk through there talking about biblical events that took place there, that are going to take place there. It's pretty overwhelming. We're going to go up on the temple on the Mount of Olives and talk prophecy. We're going to have prophecy talk on the Mount of Olives where Jesus literally gave the Olivet Discourse. It's going to be epic. But right now, I do not have the money for the trip. Right now, I'm so broke that I couldn't afford to put cheese on our mousetrap. I had to put a picture of cheese. But it worked. The problem was I didn't catch a mouse, but I caught a picture of a mouse. But sorry for the lame joke. I had to tell it. But anyway, either way, I do plan on going. It's really weird telling jokes and not hearing any laughs. I really hope everybody that was watching this laughed at what I just said, because I just felt awkward right there. But anyway, either way you look at it, my Jerusalem experience that I'm planning, it is going to be the most epic, enjoyable Jerusalem trip anyone has ever had. The most informative. It's going to be absolutely great. And talking about all the things that took place there, and Job 1 and 2. One more event. I mean, right there where you saw us walking in that video, we were right in the general area where that took place. It wasn't in heaven. And this is, again, I don't know for sure, any details. I just know it for sure wasn't in heaven. It was on earth. And every rule these people try to create to make it heaven, it doesn't work. The going up and down doesn't work. You're not supposed to go up and down as a talebearer. We can't go to heaven and tell tales. From the presence of the Lord. That doesn't have to be in heaven. It's always on earth, always around the tabernacle. And think about it. When we see, if you recognize the fact too, that the presence of the Lord was in the tabernacle during the time of Moses, during the time of Israel, but it was also during the time of Job that it was also in a tabernacle. Then you have to wonder, was it also in a tabernacle during the time of Cain and Abel? Was there a tabernacle then? Ladies and gentlemen, the house of God did not start. It did not start on Mount Sinai. That is a dispensational way of thinking. And when you lose dispensationalism, the Bible comes alive in so many ways. And so I hope this was informative and helpful. If you didn't find it interesting, you know what? I'm still glad I did it because I enjoy talking about it. I love showing pictures from my trip to Israel. And when you see these things, man, it makes the Bible just come alive. Just seem it's so real. What these other people are teaching makes the Bible seem sci-fi and fake, and it just doesn't fit. And so either way, lose dispensationalism, interpret the Bible with the Bible, and you will never get what people are pulling from Job. Now, in closing, I almost forgot to cover this, and this is important too, because I know what somebody's going to do. They're going to say, well, what about Job 38:7? Okay, now let's go ahead and go to Job chapter 38. And let me just do something that you'll never hear dispensationalists do. And that's admit that I don't know for sure what this passage means. Okay, and these are the passages that dispensationalists like to go nuts on. But it says, when the morning stars sang together and the sons of God shouted for joy. And what if you start at verse 4, where wast thou when I laid the foundation of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. Who hath laid the measures thereof? If thou knowest, who hath stretched the line upon it? Whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened? Or who laid the cornerstone thereof? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. And when you read that passage there, it kind of what they'll tell you, it kind of looks like that we've got the angels cheering on God during creation. Okay, are you sure that's what that means? Because God is asking Job a series of questions that Job does not have answers to. Now, where did you get the answers to all those questions that Job couldn't answer? Listen, if you can't answer the question, why would you create a doctrine around it? Why would you use it as proof of a doctrine? I don't know for sure what he's talking about. Okay, I've got theories, but they're not really worth anything. I'm not going to pretend I can answer a question that Job wasn't able to answer. God does not give Job the answer to these questions. God asked Job all these questions just to basically show him, hey, you just trust me. I know what I'm doing. I know more than you do. And yet people will use Genesis 38:7 as proof of their whacked out sons of God doctrine. I'm not even sure what God's talking about right there. I can't answer any of those questions, and you know what? Neither can you. So to use that as a proof text for a doctrine is ridiculous. And can you at least be honest enough as a dispensationalist to say, I don't know what that's talking about? Don't use that as a proof text for something. So either way, one more area where our doctrine is better than the dispensationalist doctrine. And I hope you found this helpful and interesting. And so I do. I appreciate everyone watching these. It helps keep me motivated. I appreciate those who like, subscribe, do all that to help get this out there. I would do these things even if not many people are watching, but it is encouraging to know people are watching. I just, different events I go to, meeting people who watch the program. Just talked to somebody this week. I saw at meetings. I was like, hey, I watch your program. That stuff, it's motivating, it's encouraging, and I appreciate everyone doing that and helping spread the word. It really does mean a lot, but I hope if you get anything, you don't just learn more stuff so you can go rub dispensationalist noses in it. I hope it makes you a better Christian. I hope it makes you appreciate the Bible more and study it more. And so anyway, thank you so much for watching this. God bless you. We will see you all next time.